1968, Los Angeles. An era in Hollywood when only the camera was truth. What was seen on screen was accepted. Chuck Norris was the unbeatable champion of karate for the world. Real titles, real fights, real respect. And Bruce Lee? For the people, just a fast movie star. More style, less reality. But that morning, in a small training hall, they were both in the same room. No cameras, no audience, no rules. The door closed, and what happened after that was never officially shown, because if that truth had come out then, the distinction between a real fighter and a movie fighter in martial arts would have ended there. Training began, and it slowly became clear that there was no winning or losing here. Beliefs were about to be shattered here. What you saw on the screen was just acting. The real truth was in that room, and that truth was so uncomfortable that it was hidden. America in the 1960s didn't take martial arts seriously. Boxing was real, wrestling was entertaining, but Eastern martial arts were seen as merely a collection of exotic moves. It was in this environment that Bruce Lee became a part of Hollywood. On screen, he appeared confident, fast, and sharp, but once the cameras were off, people still viewed him with suspicion. To producers, he was a performer, not a fighter. To directors, he was a choreographer, not a combat expert. Bruce Lee felt all this, but he didn't argue. He simply observed, and by observing, he had reached a conclusion. The world was considering fighting a bad thing. At this time, there was another world on the other side which was completely different. Tournament halls, medals, trophies, and real contact fights. One big name in this world was Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris was not just an actor, he was a fighter first. The discipline of the Air Force, the pressure of karate championships, and the tested experience with real opponents. When people mentioned Chuck Norris, they thought of a solid, powerful, unbeatable martial artist. And when people mentioned Bruce Lee, they often thought of movie scenes. That's why when these two entered the same training space, expectations were clear. Chuck Norris was considered strong. Bruce Lee was considered fast, but fragile. People assumed that if there was ever a real comparison, size, power, and tradition would win out. But that was just the external consideration. Something else was going on inside. Bruce Lee was one of the most controversial martial artists of his time because he rejected styles. He said that belts only matter, not skills. He said that rules don't matter in real combat. And most dangerous of all, he wanted to learn from champions, not to challenge them, but to understand their systems. So when Bruce Lee decided to train with Chuck Norris, it wasn't a match of egos, it was an experiment. For Chuck Norris, it was casual training. For Bruce Lee, it was a test not just of punches, but of philosophies. And here begins a story the public never saw in full, because what was about to happen wasn't just a comparison of strength, it was a lesson that stayed within that room. The air in that training hall was strange, not like in normal gyms where noise, music, and egos swirl. It was a controlled silence, the kind of silence that only exists where two serious people are trying to understand each other. Both were observing each other's movement patterns, how they breathed, who blinked, who moved more, who didn't move at all. Chuck noticed that Bruce's weight never settled on one foot. He was constantly making micro-adjustments, very small, almost invisible movements, the kind of movements that people normally wouldn't notice, but that a trained eye would. And that's where Chuck realized for the first time that this wasn't just movie speed, it was something more. Bruce observed too. He noticed that whenever Chuck imagined an imaginary attack, his right shoulder tensed fractionally.
Very slightly, but enough. It was the kind of thing that creates openings in fights. Bruce didn't say anything. He just took note. The first phase of training was kept slow, light movement, distance control, timing drills, no punches, no kicks, just movement. This is where another interesting thing happened. When Chuck moved forward, Bruce didn't move backward. He would slide sideways, but never move in a straight line. Every step had an angle. Every movement had a purpose. This was the moment where expectation quietly began to crack, because normally, when a lightweight fighter faces a heavier or stronger opponent, he creates distance. Bruce was destroying distance, but without aggression, just through presence. The people in the corners of the training hall, assistants, students, weren't making any noise. They seemed to understand that this wasn't a normal session. This was the kind of training that only happens when two high-level minds are reading each other. And then, just when everyone thought it was just a warm-up, Bruce said something small. It sounded casual, but it completely changed the tone of the training. He said he wanted to test real timing. No technique, no power, just timing. At this point, the build-up ends, because the next phase wasn't just training, it was the moment when assumptions were about to shatter. The atmosphere in the training hall was slowly changing. What had initially seemed like casual practice had now become a silent test, sweat dripping onto the floor, the sound of light breathing, and awareness rising with every movement. This is the stage where fighters decide whether this is just exercise or something more, and both had realized it wasn't just exercise. Bruce Lee relaxed his body even more, as if he didn't want to allow any tension at all. His posture seemed as if he wasn't ready for a fight, but rather for a natural reaction. Seeing this, people often take the wrong signal. They mistake relaxation for weakness. But real fighters know that when the body is tense, the reaction slows down. And Bruce wanted to live before the reaction, not with the reaction. Chuck Norris put on gloves, not heavy gloves, but light sparring gloves. It was a sign that he wanted to work with control, but not completely fake. His stance narrowed slightly. His weight shifted slightly forward. It was a tournament reflex. When pressure comes, the body moves into its most practiced position. For Chuck, that was the classical base of karate. Stable, powerful, reliable. Bruce wore no protective gear. No gloves, no pads, just bare hands and that relaxed posture. This didn't draw any comment, but the people in the corner of the room certainly noticed. This wasn't arrogance. This was trust. Trust in his system. The distance closed, very slowly, as if both were trying to feel each other's boundaries. Chuck threw the first probing kick, not full power, not full speed, just a test. Bruce didn't block the kick. He took a half step to the side, just enough so that the kick didn't even touch his body. But what was more interesting was that Bruce didn't counter. He just read the space. Chuck made another hand feint. Bruce didn't even blink. This was the moment when a new signal entered Chuck's brain for the first time. Normally, feints create reactions. There was no reaction here. There was only awareness. Then Bruce made a move, not to attack, just to cut the distance. A small step, but with an angle. Suddenly, he was in a place Chuck wasn't expecting. This was something that doesn't happen in textbooks. It was something that only comes from experience and feel. The training hall was now breathless. People were thinking this wasn't sparring. This wasn't a demonstration. This was a live experiment where two different fighting philosophies were testing each other. Traditional structure versus adaptive flow. Form versus freedom. And in this setting, when the two had come extremely close, when space had almost vanished, the moment was about to come where the difference not only in skill, but also in understanding would become apparent. This was the point where normal training would be irreversible. This didn't happen suddenly, nor with dramatic music. In real life, turning points often come in complete silence. That's exactly what happened in that training hall. The distance had narrowed so much that both could almost feel each other's breath. This is the point where theory ends and instinct begins. Chuck Norris landed the first real attack. Not for show, not to prove himself, just a clean, controlled strike. The speed was good. The technique was perfect. It was the kind of move that wins points in tournaments and knocks people back in real fights. But Bruce Lee wasn't where the punch landed. It wasn't a dodge. It wasn't a slip. It was the timing. The punch landed, and with it, Bruce's body shifted to a new angle, so fast the eyes couldn't follow.
And then something happened that was never openly discussed afterward. Bruce didn't counter. He didn't strike. He just touched on Chuck's torso. exactly where balance and breathing are controlled simultaneously. The touch was light, almost polite, but the message was heavy. This is where you could be finished. Chuck immediately stepped back, not because he was hurt, but because he had a realization. He understood that if it were real, it wouldn't just be a touch, it would be a hit, and after a hit, there's no chance of recovery. Training continued. Attacks came. Feints came. Bruce moved each time where the power was going, sometimes forward, sometimes to the side, sometimes completely inside. What was most unsettling was that Bruce never rushed, no aggression, no desperation, just calm adjustments, as if he knew every attack in advance. Chuck increased his speed. Bruce slowed his movements further. The distance narrowed. Now every exchange was like a whisper, short, sharp, precise. Another moment came where Bruce could strike again, this time close to the neck. Again, just a touch. Again, a silent message. This was the moment where training stopped. No one said stop. Both stopped on their own, because both knew it had gone beyond sparring. This was a point of understanding. This was a place where ego, only respect, remained. Chuck took a deep breath. There was no shock on his face. There was acceptance. He understood that this wasn't just a difference in speed. It was a difference in thinking, structure versus adaptability, planned response versus living awareness. And in that moment, a truth never shown on screen dawned. Bruce Lee hadn't come to win the fight. He was just trying to finish it. After the training stopped, there were no applause in the room. There was no excitement. There was only a deep, heavy silence, the kind of silence that often speaks louder than noise. The two fighters faced each other, but now there was no competition between them. There was only understanding. This is the moment when a person either holds on to his ego or abandons it. Here, ego was abandoned. Chuck didn't say anything for a few seconds. He was trying to normalize his breathing, but the real process was going on in his mind. He wasn't just wondering what had happened, he was wondering why. He had followed the rules his entire training life, form, distance, structure, and now he was faced with a system that didn't follow the rules, but moved ahead of them. Bruce was completely normal, no victory pose, no smile of dominance, as if nothing special had happened. This was also a lesson, because people who have real control don't need to prove it. Bruce picked up the water bottle, took a sip, and simply said that it was just an exchange, not a fight, but there was a lot hidden in that one sentence. The people sitting in the corners of the room were now looking at each other. There was confusion and respect on their faces. For some, this was uncomfortable, because everything they had learned was now being questioned, and for others, it was enlightening, because for the first time they understood that fighting was not just a technique. Chuck nodded slowly. He acknowledged, not defeat, not victory, just recognition. He said he saw something today that's never taught in tournaments. This line never came up in interviews afterward, maybe because it wasn't marketable to Hollywood, because Hollywood wants clear winners and losers. This session wasn't making either of them losers. The training officially ended, but the real impact began there. For Chuck, it wasn't just an experience, it was a rethinking of his movement, his timing, his expectations. For Bruce, it was confirmation that what he was thinking wasn't just theory, it was practical. And the most dangerous thing was that it was silent. This was a truth that was never shown, because if it had been shown, it would have been difficult to divide martial arts into categories. Heroes and villains would have become blurred, and where systems become blurred, business becomes uncomfortable. There was no press release after that training session. There were no interviews. There were no headlines, and perhaps that's why the impact of that day was so profound. Some things only survive if they're not overhyped and sold. This training was one of those things. Bruce Lee went his own way. Chuck Norris went his, but neither path was exactly the same as before. If you watch Chuck Norris's fights and movements carefully in recent years, you'll notice a subtle change. He doesn't rely solely on technique. He reads space. He utilizes angles. He doesn't shy away from pressure, but moves with it. These things aren't found in karate manuals. They only come with experience or by meeting someone who thinks beyond the rules. For Bruce Lee,
This moment was a confirmation of his vision. He always said that the future of martial arts lay not in a single style, but in adaptation. At that time, people laughed at this statement. They thought Bruce was simply rebellious and disrespectful. But time gradually proved that Bruce was only looking ahead. What he was saying in the 1960s, the world began to understand decades later. What Hollywood showed was the safe version, on-screen rivalry, drama, clear winners and losers. But real training wrote a different story, one where no one won, no one lost, only a new understanding emerged. And that's why that story was never officially promoted, because systems don't like stories where the lines blur. People still ask what would happen if Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris faced off in a real fight. This very question is wrong, because those who understand this training know that Bruce Lee's goal wasn't to win the fight. His goal was to eliminate the need for the fight. And when the goals are different, comparison becomes pointless. The most interesting part of this legacy is that neither of them discussed it much. Respect was high, ego was low, and where there is respect, there are no loud claims. There are only silent acknowledgments. The biggest lesson of this story isn't about punches and kicks. It's not even about power. It's about control. Bruce Lee always said that true strength lies not in muscles, but in awareness. A person who understands his own body understands the bodies of others as well. And one who lets go of his ego has an advantage in every situation. In that training, Bruce didn't prove he was a better fighter. He showed what better thinking was. Fighting isn't just a game of reaction, it's a game of perception. The one who sees first moves first, and the one who moves first doesn't need much power. For Chuck Norris, it wasn't a defeat, it was an upgrade. For Bruce Lee, it wasn't a victory, it was an alignment. Both learned something, both gave up something, and that's why this moment was authentic, because real learning always happens on both sides. Today, when people quote Bruce Lee, "Be water," they often take it to mean simply flexibility. But the true meaning of that training was that water never clashes, it adjusts, it flows, and when necessary, it even cuts a path. Bruce Lee was an example of this. So when you hear this story, don't just think of it as a hidden training session. Think of it as a reminder that what the world shows you is often not the whole truth. The real truth is often written in closed rooms, without cameras, without sound. And maybe that's why the training that was never shown is remembered even today.